Step 3 is our risk response development. Mitigating risk is doing things to reduce the likelihood that that risk is even going to occur and trying to reduce the impact of the adverse event. So if we know that having technical issues is one of the risks that we have, then as we're planning our project and staging our project, we want to do everything we can to reduce the likelihood that that risk even occurs. Avoiding risk. This is when we change the project plan completely to eliminate the specific risk or condition. And then transferring risk. Transferring risk is when we pass the risk to another party. This is an example of insurance. So we buy insurance so that an insurance agency is responsible for the risk. They take on the level of risk for us. Another way to transfer risk is requiring this build, own, operate, transfer, or a BOOT provision. For this type of risk is that you would require whoever is building the project to, and it depends on certain kinds of projects that you're being taken on, but they would take on the risk of building it and operating it. And then once it's guaranteed that it's going to be successful or it makes money or whatever, then they can transfer. So they're taking on the risk at the very beginning. Or we can make a conscious decision to just accept the risk. Some risk can't be controlled for. If it happens, and we're just going to accept it and figure out a way through it. We recognize that rain delays construction projects. So then we're just going to accept the risk that rain can extend any construction project by an uncalculable number of days. When we develop a contingency plan, this is an alternative plan that we use in case a risk event actually occurs. So it's a plan of actions that help reduce the negative impact or consequences of that event. If we have a contingency plan in place, we have a communication plan in place. We have a responsibility plan in place. So when these risk things happen, we know who to call, who's in charge, who's making those decisions. Wherever if we don't have a contingency plan in place, we end up making emergency decisions, which are not always our best, most thought out decisions. We might not have know who exactly needs to make that response. Then we have delays in a response. Any delay in a response can be expensive and costly. So we want to have those contingency plans in place to at least have the communication plans and the responsibility plans. If this risk occurs, who gets called, who's responsible, who makes the decisions. So here we have this example. We have the risk event, our interface problems. We're going to mitigate the two that we said were red zone problems, interface problems and our system freezing. We're going to try to mitigate them through our prototype testing. We have a contingency plan. We have a trigger for that contingency plan. So for an example, if the system freezes and after an hour it has not unfrozen, we're going to reinstall the operating system. Who is responsible for that happening? Emmylou. We also have backup strategies if our chosen technology fails. And then we need to look at whether technical uncertainties can be resolved. So when we have high-tech projects, we need to know what kind of backup strategies we might have if those kinds of technology fails, how we might plan for those, and then how we can resolve for some of those uncertainties. For example, we had that derecho in central Iowa that went right across the state and around the Cedar Rapids and some other areas. I know I was reading about Tama also being affected. One of the things that happened is a lot of the power lines and internet lines were taken out. So then we have school starting and we have not a lot of internet access. And so data hotspots are being utilized as their backup. So they have a backup strategy. Their chosen technology is internet service. Their backup strategy is using data hotspots. Now they're starting to have issues with the data hotspots that they purchased running out. So then what would be their next contingency plan in that case? For schedule risks, we might have slack built in, imposed duration dates, an absolute project finish date, compression of a project schedules due to a shortened project duration date. We're going to talk about compression of projects in Chapter 9. But we can build slack into a project if we know that there's a chance that that project is going to run over. We can also impose duration dates. If you remember a couple of chapters ago when I brought up the major construction project that was happening outside of the city of Ames on Highway 30, they had built into all of their contracts with subcontractors that any delay of the project would result in a fine to the subcontractor. Then we have cost and funding risks. So what are the different cost risks? Are prices going to go up? Then if as the duration of the project increase, the likelihood that the prices are going to go up also increase. It's harder to control costs over a very long project. Funding risks. If we have a grant or a government funded project, or we're a nonprofit and we're depending on outside funding sources such as donations and stuff. If we have changes in the supply of funds, that can impact the likelihood of our projects happening, implementation or completion of our project. We also have opportunity management. So instead of just focusing on all of the negative risks that can happen, we can also recognize that good things can happen. There are opportunities, and we can take one of these 4 different actions when those opportunities come place. One is to exploit opportunities. So we seek out any opportunities that can happen to make sure they definitely happen. We might make a list of various opportunities and then actively seek those opportunities out. Sharing in ownership. So allocating some or all of the ownership of an opportunity to another party who might be able to capture that opportunity best. So we might find an opportunity and it's not the best thing for us, but we know someone who would be able to take full advantage of that. So we're going to put that opportunity onto them. We can enhance by taking action to increase the probability or the positive impact of the opportunity. And then we can also accept it. We would take advantage of any opportunity that occurs, but we're not actively taking action to pursue opportunities coming up. Another thing that we want to talk about are contingency funding and time buffers. So contingency funds are reserves that are created to cover project risks. These are identified risks and these unknown risks that we can't always identify for. The size of funds depends on the overall risk of a project and the time of the project. Most contingency funds run in the 1 to 10% range of total project cost. However, high-tech projects or projects with high risk need larger contingency funds. Time buffers are amounts of time used to compensate for unplanned delays in the project schedule. Then we want to look at those merge activities, non-critical activities, scarce resource activities, and those activities that have the highest risk. We might want to build in different kinds of time buffers into projects depending on what they are. As I said earlier, time buffers are very important when we're talking about projects that are happening outside and can be affected by weather more commonly than projects that are happening indoors and aren't as affected by weather. So when we're looking at this contingency fund estimate, we have a budget baseline, the budget reserve, and the total project budget. So that budget reserve is available for any cost overages that happen just in normal risk management. The management reserve is designed for those unknown risks that come about that the manager needs to make decisions about releasing the reserve or not. Step 4 is looking at these risk responses. So who is in charge of executing our risk response strategy? Who monitors the triggering events for those risks? Who initiates our contingency plans that we wrote at the beginning of our planning stages? And then we might watch for new risks that could be happening. So we're going to use all of this information to establish a change management system. We want to foster open communication around the environment in our organization so that we know when risk is coming. Someone else within the organization who is not on our project team might know of impending risk, such as funding risk that could be coming down from budgetary problems within the company. And we need that to be communicated to us sooner than later. For example, we want to assign and document responsibility for managing risk. We want to know who is in charge. Okay. When we're looking at change management, the steps of managing these change is to identify what the proposed changes are. We can have change to scope, change to budget, changes to schedule, making a list of any expected effects of proposed changes on schedule and budget. Usually if we go over schedule, we're going to go over budget, so they go hand in hand with each other. Then we're going to look, review, evaluate, and approve or disapprove of changes formally. We want to build into how do we make decisions about what can and can't change on this project for everything from scope to schedule to budget, and how risk might control some of those changes that are going to happen. We want to assign responsibility for who is in charge of implementing that change. That needs to be a huge part of project management, to have a communication plan, not only a communication plan just for your project, but also a communication plan of who needs to be contacted and who needs to make decisions if something happens, if an emergency occurs, if we're going to change something about that project, et cetera, et cetera. Who is authorized to do that? So this is just a graphic example of that change control process. Benefits of having a formal change control system are that we are monitoring all of our changes. Inconsequential changes are discouraged by needing a formal process. So if every time you might want to make a change to scope or scheduling or costs, you have to go through this formal process, you're going to be less likely to approach this for inconsequential changes. So it helps reduce some of that bike shedding issues that we've talked about in an earlier chapter, where if I think I'm going to push the project off by one day, I'm not going to propose any change that is going to make that happen, because it probably takes more time to go through the process than just the one day of change. Okay. We also have tracking. We have a communication log of what changes happen, when they happen, why they happen, who approved them, and what cost is going to occur with them. The more records we have of our project management, the better we are when we get into the performance measurement of how effective the project was, how efficient we were, and how well we were about keeping on schedule. This is an example of a change request. So we're looking for, we're doing a project. It's an Irish-Chinese culture exchange. We want to request river dancers to replace the original Irish dance group that we had. And we want to request one combination dance with the Chinese ballet group and the river dancers. What is the scope? What's the cost? Who is in charge of it? The priority is urgent. The funding source is the customer is paying for it. And then we have who needs to sign off on approvals. This is an example of a change request log. So when was the change requested? The date received, the date submitted, the amount, whether it was approved or it's still open, any comments that came along with that. And that is the end of